I think probably in terms of morals and ethics, Nietzsche is one of the most revolutionary thinkers of the last 200, 300, 400, 500 years. And in some respects, his views on morality have not been totally taken on board because they can't be in a liberal democratic, humanist and egalitarian age. His views on morality are regarded as interesting academically, in inverted commas, but that's because they must be kept rather like a germ locked up in the laboratory. Morally, he's an anti-humanist and he's an inverse Christian and he's a pagan of a very extreme sort, and he wishes to return in a stylized way to the morality of the aristocracy or the ruling classes of the ancient world, and he wishes to miss out completely the morality that Christianity put in place, and which is considered even by many people who've repudiated Christianity to be the basis for human morality. He repudiates a significant proportion, but not all, of Jewish morality, and also Islamic morality as well. So in a way, the three great moral lexicons of the Abrahamical tradition are repudiated in one fell swoop, and you have a return to a might is right philosophy. That, in a crude sense, is what Nietzsche's moral discourse amounts to, as he believes it exists biologically and in nature. What is crude and violent and sterile and semi-criminal, as it could be configured at one level, is cast adrift and becomes something more noble as it's hierarchicalized and spiritualized, and as it's taken up from its more crudely lethal and each against all and Hobbesian points of departure. It's the level to which things are hierarchicalized. It's the level to which they're taken away from the sort of sulphurous origins that they all share. That's the key point. This is why morality is a matter of distancing. It's a matter of the pathos of difference between one form and another, between one action and another, between one man and another. Morality is therefore discriminatory. In the present parlance, there's nothing worse than discrimination, because discrimination is the basis of all equal moral worth, whereas his view is discrimination is the basis of morality. Everything is a matter of discrimination, and that goes for individuals, for cities, for cultures, and for all of the contemporary discriminations that you now have to sign forms if you want a job in the Western world to say that you won't engage in. Now, those are minor forms of discrimination in a way, but he would regard them all as a taxonomy of the aristocratic, that the eye immediately hierarchicalizes everything into different orders of meaning, depending where they are in a particular hierarchy. And the eye that judges where things are in a hierarchy will change from individual to individual. One of the key points about liberal humanist discourse and Christian morals, and he would consider that Christian morality and secular liberal humanist morality are very close, but he would consider their type of morals to be universalizing and platitudinous, and also capable of far too wide a remit and extent, because this morality essentially judges everything morally. Is anyone harmed, or is the rubric of egalitarianism run through properly and efficaciously? Political correctness is just a shorthand to corral the instincts to make sure that those standards are observed. And he doesn't believe in a blanket moral response to life. In some ways, his response to life is not moral in the accepted sense. It's a morality which is aesthetic and nuanced and hierarchical and poetic, but it is not a moral view of life that regards every statement from an abstract moral position. When he configures an aristocratic morality, he does so against all the currents that were then bubbling away at the end of the 19th century and will become dominant and hegemonic in the 20th century. The paradox is, of course, much early modern life, and all of medieval life was run exactly along Nietzschean lines of moral constraint or the absence of such constraint. It's a Christian myth, of course, that the Christian centuries are in accordance with Christian morality. Christian morality is so hard to live, it's almost an impossible standard to which humans have to aspire. So Nietzsche's morals are probably the most revolutionary part of his entire discourse. Nietzsche's morals are a total refutation of radical Christianity and secular humanist norms. It's a reversal of all of those, and that's why left-wingers who dislike Nietzsche will retreat into saying he's a fascist and he's an anti-humanist and he's somebody who advocates the brutality of strength and he's somebody who's got no time for the weak at all and think that the weak have no rights, when of course he does. He thinks the weak have the right to be dominated. I think what's happened is that because he's perceived as a relativist in some ways, you can adopt a relativistic standpoint about his morals and say, oh, well, that's his view, and he's got these aristocratic attitudes, and he wants to go back, and he doesn't understand the progress that we've made in the moral area, and you can therefore take his epistemology, and you can take his critique of modernity, and you can take his critique of decadence, and you can take his critique of German nationalism, and you can take all the bits that you want and relativize the morality out. But morally, his view is hierarchical. It depends what's being done to somebody and why it's being done, and it depends on who they are, and it depends upon the suffering which is engendered, and it depends whether they were born for a higher level of suffering or not, because suffering is a part of life. And therefore his attitude towards morality is less humane, more aesthetic. It's an aesthetic morality as much as anything else. And that's deeply shocking. It's still even deeply shocking today. I think as to the common man's view of Nietzsche, he's thought of as the great philosopher of atheism and of 20th century existentialism, whereby man is cast in an anxious guise, waiting for death and not knowing whether there are any ultimate truths or not. Yeah, I think in relation to the person who's heard some intellectual talk but no more, the person who's slightly skim-read an Albert Camus novel, they would consider him to be an existential philosopher, which is very much how he was packaged in the 1950s and 60s, when prior to post-structuralism and deconstruction, existentialism looked to Nietzsche as one of its founding anti-gods. I think those are the ways in which he's perceived in a common way, and also in a stereotypical way, as a philosopher who's some way linked up with German National Socialism. So that Melange, a sort of sinister figure who yet, for surviving one of the triumvirate, Marx, Freud, Nietzsche, these three big thinkers who come out of the 19th century, early 20th century in Freud's case, Nietzsche's the only one left standing. There is a left-wing Nietzsche which is around today, and this celebrates his tearing down, the fact that he tore down the curtain of Christianity, that he's not a metaphysical traditionalist at the level of pure philosophy. The way into a left-wing interpretation of Nietzsche is to concentrate on epistemology, which is thinking about thinking, because you could argue that Nietzsche is a radical subjectivist at one level, and also that he doesn't believe that there are totally objective standards outside time, history, place, and circumstance. This renders him a relativist by some accounts, and he can then be used to engage in exercises of moral relativism, particularly in relation to traditional religiosity. In Western Europe, there is this view of Nietzsche that he's one of the great destructive philosophers, that he bulldozes an enormous amount of traditional or archaic or hierarchical or conservative ground, and this prepares the way for a new beginning post-Christianity. He's seen also in the light of contemporary literary theory, which is very fashionable in the Western Academy. These are theories called post-structuralism, and the later version of the same thing called deconstruction, whereby manuscripts and texts are taken apart in a new left scholasticism, and the text is then considered to be independent of its own author and to be a thing in its own right, and to be studied in a deep way which brings forth all of its manifold contradictions to such a degree that no one can affirm anything. So there is this left-wing interpretation of Nietzsche which has gained quite a lot of ground and has provided a shield to many critics in the centre and on the left who would point to Nietzsche's unswerving political incorrectness in all sorts of areas. His hostility to feminism, his advocacy of human inequality of quite a radical type, the suspicion that he entertained certain racial or national views and so on, which never quite leaves the liberal zeitgeist and always means there's a smell around him of some sort or another. His hostility to democracy, which is one of the most scandalous aspects of his thought, and which is largely overlooked. It's just he's considered to be a creature of his time. The aristocratic attitudes of the late 19th century were anti-democratic, and he's parcelled up historically in that way, because people who wish to preserve him for other reasons overlook tendencies in his thought which they wouldn't overlook otherwise. So first of all, there's this left and centre-left interpretation of him, which is a reinterpretation. It's a form of cultural revisionism, actually, where you take the bits you like and reject or silence the bits that you don't otherwise care for. I think that interpretation only goes so far, though, because although he tore down for half his career, up until about the Spake Zarathustra, after that, he constructs. He's a very constructive philosopher once you get past the wreckage of what he considered to be late 19th century civilization and its antecedents. So then you have the constructive Nietzsche, where he basically puts a whole new Western philosophy in place, which is his own teachings, really, his own quasi-Bible, thus Spake Zarathustra, but is meant in some ways to be a sort of heretical holy book, whereby the new philosophy of the Superman and of the future will be laid out. And with that, there are sort of other runners, like on the genealogy of morals, which, although it appears to be a speculative and relativist work up to a point, is really a desire to return to the morality of the ancient world, the morality of the pre-Christian world, and a sort of aristocratic attitude for a radically aristocratic way of thinking. I also think he wants to get away from what is regarded as dualism, the idea that you have good and you have its counterpart evil, and that these are metaphysical certainties that are very ancient and grafted into the heart of the Christian religion. All three of the Hebraic faiths are very dualist in relation to morality and have a large pre-codified codex about what is moral and what is immoral. And his belief is that morality is in part socially derived and is culturally expressed. And in an aristocratic society, that which is good, beautiful, true, and so on will be regarded as exalted and moral. And that which is low or mean or ugly or debased will be regarded as evil or bad, as the opposite of good. And he thinks that is an axiomatic and understandable way of looking at it. What he thinks has happened is that morality has become inverted by virtue of the morality of those who suffered or were enslaved in the ancient world. And this is what he calls slave morality. And he associates slave morality and the desire to eradicate it to be part and parcel of the ethical substructure of Christianity. And he regards Christianity, ethically speaking, as a revenge of the low upon the high, and as a revenge of the low-born upon the high-born, and as a revenge almost against the ancient world itself, ushering in the Middle Ages, where everything is moralized and everything is divided into a good act or a good thought, and that if mankind is to progress on from this stupor, it has to return to more ancient verities, more ancient feelings, whereby actions are described as good and bad, depending upon whether they impinge upon whether something is high or low. He's also very much opposed to the idea of instantaneous valorization, whereby everything is determined in accordance with a prior indicator as to whether it's good or evil, and that all of one's judgments are then coloured by that particular alternation. And he sees Christianity over 2,000 years as the main vehicle for this valorization, so that all higher standards are traduced and brought down to the instincts and unfettered pleasures and life chances of those who are ill-born and ill-conceived. Nietzsche would look at the ancient origins of words and trace through over centuries their change over time, where many words meant masculine beauty or warlike ardour or chivalry or courage under stress and bravery under pressure, and these words were changed over time, as in the case of virtue, to mean something that was approximately its opposite. And this is part of the way in which words are wrenched out of their context and reused in order to deflate one set of meanings and enhance another at a later date. So he basically considers the good and the good life to be that which tends towards aristocratic virtue in its prior definitional structure. So one carries oneself well, one has an integration of body and spirit, one looks well and looks good, that which manifests greater courage on the battlefield and in the political structures of a particular time. These are naturally good in and of themselves, but they're not universally good. They're good for a particular class of persons. They're good for a particular sensibility that goes with that aristocratic class of persons. They're not necessarily good for others. They don't really go with the flow of majority desires at all. Indeed, they're militant minority desires. I've just seen the British film of Shakespeare's Coriolanus, and Coriolanus always strikes me as a particular text that's very emblematic of the sort of genealogy of the morals of which Nietzsche approved, where you have this extraordinary arrogance towards the Roman plebs, you have the consul as, in a sense, set above the people, if not even the Senate itself, and you have an aristocratic morality to court, which is not just conceptual, but rooted in the words that it chooses to use, rooted in a detestation of the majority even, and rooted in a maximalization of particularism and of the pathos of difference and of minority and individualized sentiment, as long as that individualism is high-born. This creation of a master morality as being the inner morality of the Grecian aristocracy and of other aristocracies as well, such as the Persian, the Scandinavian, the Japanese, and so forth. Maybe the British imperial aristocracy in its heyday, which could be analogous to the Elizabethan period. Probably Nietzsche would have found the 19th century too stultifying and too moralistic. But the Elizabethan swagger was something that was very close to his heart, untainted by Christian morality and existing in a pagan residue, whereby they cast aside traditional notions of good and evil to embrace what was customarily known as the aristocratic aristocratic good or a master as against a slave morality. The Jews carry to the strongest degree the sort of anti or transverse moralism, which is opposed to these, what he considers to be these verities of the ancient world. They invert the master morality and make a slave morality. This is the idea that those who suffer and those who undergo the agonies of privation and those who are in a weaker position are automatically morally in an enhanced state and are indeed superior by virtue of their suffering. And the more suffering that they have, the more ennobled they are by it. And obliviousness to the suffering of another is itself a sign of moral inadequacy, so that those who sympathize with the suffering of others and those who undergo suffering themselves are on the way to a superior lexicon in relation to what it is to be moral. And also the concept of pity for oneself and pity for another, becomes the elixir of moral goodness, where Nietzsche himself loathes and reviles pity for oneself and for others, and regards it as the epitome of what he calls slave morality. Now, the reason all of this was done was the fact that the Jews were victims of Roman imperialism, and they wished to slip the yoke of Rome and assert their own tribal and cultural independence. And they took away from the masters the weapons of the masters subtly and religiously and linguistically to give themselves the weapons to store their own armory. Nietzsche considers this taking of the idea of the beauty of pitilessness when perceived in an aristocratic vein and inverting it so that beauty is sympathy for the weak and those who suffer to be one of the great devices by means of which the weak can humiliate and humble the strong. Nietzsche considers that the Jews were cardinal in developing this textuality for what it was to be moral in the future. And Christianity becomes a generalized ethical Judaism for Gentiles. The morality that was put forward by ancient Hebraic faith as an inversion of classical and aristocratic values to be used by a people that wish to claim its own destiny is then wrenched from their hands and sublimated into the big ethical structures of the enormous religions of the Middle East, which are for Gentile consumption, principally Christianity and Islam. Nietzsche has very little to say about Islam and probably would be more favourable towards Islam than towards Christianity, partly because of Islam's patriarchy, partly because of its attitude towards women, partly because Islam is a third pagan, unlike Christianity, which seeks to be a complete repudiation of the pagan past. That's one of the important elements here, that Nietzsche just doesn't preach a return to aristocratic radicalism. He preaches a return to the paganism that preceded Christianity for the whole of society. And he also wishes to see that each layer of the society has a role, but its role is defined from the top downwards, not from the bottom upwards. So I think that the uniqueness of monotheism as a doctrine, totally contrary to the pagan pantheon and worldview, is cardinal for understanding the way in which modern morality works, particularly in universal faiths, unlike Judaism, which are monotheistic. The difference between Christianity and Islam and Judaism, of course, is that Jews don't really seek, apart from the odd individual, converts, whereas Judeo-Christianity and Islam rely on conversion. So this conversion of the rest of the world, or large stretches of it, to enormous standalone monotheistic structures, the morality of which favours the morality of suffering, the efficacy of pity, the sanctimony of, in some respects, the feminine over the masculine, the adoption of pacifism as a moral standard, and the belief that the last shall be first and the first shall be last in almost all areas is part and parcel of these faiths. And he considers this to be uniquely Jewish in origin. He holds this group responsible for an original transvaluation of values, but the ultimate recrudescence of Judaism is in Christianity. You have seen a collapse in the importance of Christian structures, in the importance of the Church of England in a society like Britain or England, and yet post-Christian values are more entrenched than ever before, and certainly its ethics are as strong now as they ever have been, and the conservatism that was part of those ethics has largely been done away with. So you now have a large secular liberal humanism without the Christian faith coexisting with this large spread secularization. I think that Christianity will be the dominant religion, not Islam, 100 to 200 years from now, because it has so much to feed on in the third world, because it is a religion for all who suffer. It is a religion for all those who are not necessarily at the top of their own society. And it spreads that part of Islam, which is itself Christian, that preaches love, peace and tolerance. Islam without Baha'ism and without that which springs forth into terrorist outrages would be very close to Christianity. Indeed, Christianity may have a future that's rather like Islam, because there is no clerisy for the whole of Islam. There's just localized priesthoods and holy men who go about preaching. So Islam's always had this devolved and rather libertarian structure. It's a very authoritarian religion, but it's very non-authoritarian in the way in which it operates. Any house can be turned into a mosque just by doing a few simple things and putting down a few carpets and segregating the believers when they pray along gender lines and so on. Many of the values of Christianity can and are being spread by Islam, paradoxically. So I think Christianity's got quite a lively future, but it's not necessarily in the West. In the West, it is being overtaken by the secular humanism that's eating it alive, and the number of people who live in the West now without any fixed adherence to Christianity at all is quite startling from a Christian point of view. You also have the paradox of mass immigration into the Western world, and you have the replenishing of Christianity by many of these immigrants who wish to cling to the prior adherence of faith, partly in relation to the alienation they feel. Christianity is a great source of comfort to many immigrants in the West. So I feel that Christianity's still got quite a lot of kick in it, but it will be third world immigration into Western societies. It will be the extension of Christianity's strength outside the West, and it will be the totalizing of liberal humanist values within the West as a surrogate for Christian norms, at least in the area of ethics. So I think these three areas are the areas where the egalitarian impulses of Christianity will continue to grow, even as the religion faces near collapse in countries like Norway and Sweden and Finland and England. I think in relation to the current state of present modernity, the fact that he survived, the fact that Freud and Marx have fared far less well, is a notable and interesting point for the future. I also think that any right that's got a future will have to partly base itself around Nietzsche's thinking, as I have always done. This is very difficult electorally because there's so much of a charge left in Christianity in terms of practical politics, particularly in a society like the United States. But I think the sad truth is that a new right that calls itself such, without antagonizing Christianity too much, will have to base itself around the greatest thinker of the non-left who is visible. And also the very fact that he is there and is admired by all sorts of people who have no time for a proportion of his views. We haven't even discussed his views about feminism, for example, which are so out of sync with this current era as to be almost sort of obsolete forms of 19th century prestige, because he wouldn't have even given women the vote. He wouldn't have even tolerated female involvement in practical politics. And there's a great silence about his attitudes on all of those fronts. It's difficult to see it now at the moment, but whenever chaos and radical revolutionary change comes abroad, these ideas inevitably return. However, I personally think the very fact that Nietzsche remains so important intellectually and theoretically is the harbinger of the fact that such ideas are not dead. The fact that if you go into the philosophy section of any bookshop in the Western world, Nietzsche will be there, and all sorts of other philosophers will not be there. Indeed, even Marx will not be there. His children may be there, theoretically speaking, but he may not be. And the very fact that the genealogy of morals and similar texts are widely on sale, you don't have to go very far to get them if you're interested, indicates to me that this part of the human brain scan is still out there and still open towards these sorts of opinions which are elitist and which are inegalitarian and which have a streak of hubris about them in the ancient sense, and aristo-oriented and are morally aristocratic without necessarily being sociologically so. And the very fact that these ideas are still there, despite the fact that in every other respect they're crowded from the spectrum or shouted down, and yet Nietzsche's complicated enough, virile enough, epigrammatic enough, not really to have escaped the censor's mark and to still be there, arguing for views which, at one level of reckoning, are 2,000 years old. Nietzsche is non-pessimistic and is a fabulous optimist in his way. And, of course, Nietzschean morality is about the struggle that one has with oneself to raise a man from what he might have been to what he could be. So Nietzsche will always see in almost everything that occurs a positive that might fire off to create a fire that can warm the hands of the children of tomorrow.